Hello Internet, I'm Josh from Illustria Lives, and today we're talking about psychographic profiles and trends in Age of Sigmar. Don't be scared off by that title. This is an interesting trend that I noticed and wanted to talk about regarding the fairly ubiquitous Timmy, Johnny, and Spike player profiles, first invented for, or discussed at least, for Magic the Gathering. I'll go into a brief summary of what those terms mean, but if you want to hear them laid out in more depth, Vince Venturella has a great video outlining exactly what those each mean in regards to Age of Sigmar and where most armies fall on that spectrum. I will link both of his videos, one for 2.0 and one for 3.0, in the description below. Now let's get into the video. Alright, so here we have this pyramid chart between Timmy, Johnny, and Spike. Pretty much any kind of competitive game with different factions or playstyles or classes or whatever you want to call it could have them laid out on a chart like this. Everything will fall usually mostly between each one. Sometimes you'll have one that's purely Johnny or purely Timmy, and very rarely you'll have one that is a mix of all three. So what exactly do these mean? So first off, Timmy is the easiest to understand. Timmy likes high risk, high reward, big fun moments. He wants to make a memory. He wants to have something where he can look back and think, oh, I can't believe that happened. He just wants to have fun. Big smashy monsters, big numbers, crazy effects that happen on just a 5-up. That's all things that Timmy really enjoys and has fun with. Timmy doesn't like being alpha struck, having all of his models be removed from the table before he even gets to use them, debuffs that make it so that his models can't do their cool abilities or can't act how they normally would, overly complicated rules where you have to think of weird edge case interactions, or any ability that just disables his effects. Things like Bellacore that just turn off a unit can kind of ruin the enjoyment of a game for Timmy. Next up is Johnny. Johnny really likes making a interesting, clever trick battle plan or army. He really likes synergies. He really likes really techie movement pieces, teleports. Usually has a giant list of army lists that he's planning on running, makes army lists for armies he doesn't even play, really likes utility units or armies that have a lot of different situational units that can be combined in interesting ways. He dislikes units that just do one thing, especially units that don't have any War Scroll rules or only one that's really simple, like +1 to hit on the charge or something like that. Also doesn't really like being alpha struck because it prevents him from being able to pull off whatever combo, often removes pieces that he was planning on using in some chain effect or Rube Goldberg machine. Anything that turns off command points, anything that turns off buffs, anything that can remove those support characters before they get into position are all things that he doesn't really enjoy. Basically, if you've ever had a game where the turn that you set everything up for the perfect combo and then your opponent just disabled part of it or dispelled a spell or killed a character before they could do it and you felt really, really disappointed, you probably have a little bit of Johnny in you. Right, and finally, Spike. Spike likes winning, and not in the power gamer sore loser type way. That's where he finds the most fun, is doing really well, playing efficiently, being rewarded in victory points. He likes units that do what they say on the tin. He really likes specialized units that are either a tank or a hammer or a support piece. He doesn't really find that much interest in weird utility units that provide counters to monsters specifically, or things like the Infernal and Rapturous and Slanesh that just counters particular types of lists, the Sigor in Beasts of Chaos, things along those lines. He really likes Alpha Strikes, both in his army and even in his opponents. It's not a problem like it is with the other two because he's usually planned around that and is able to compensate for it. He likes units that have high consistency, things that hit or wound on 2s, nothing that has D6 attacks or damage. And related to that, really dislikes randomness. Anything like squigs, anything that is, God forbid, D6 attacks and damage. Very high magic heavy armies, because that all comes down to dice versus dice. Random effects. If an effect doesn't happen on a 2-up or automatically, Spike really doesn't want to rely on it. Things along those lines. So, I don't want to get into every army specifically. Like I said, there's a great discussion both at the end of 2.0 and very recently on Vince Venturella's YouTube page. Both of those will be linked below. But I'm just going to be discussing a trend that I noticed between those two discussions and what I feel it means for the state of the game overall. So here we have the chart for how Vince basically discussed the game to be at the end of 2.0. You can see there's a small cluster down in the little Johnny Spike area, but overall the books are all pretty spread out. There's a good distribution everywhere. There is a clear Timmy book, a clear Spike book, and a clear Johnny book, clear hybrids, Slaves of Darkness right in the middle, and it's overall pretty consistent across the spectrum. Now, just for reference, to give any kind of color or context to this discussion, this circle is where I tend to live as a Johnny Spike player. These are the books that I'm most interested in, just to indicate any kind of bias that I have toward this discussion. And then this area is the generally agreed upon area that new player books should fall into. You want them to be a little bit simpler if you're just introducing somebody to Age of Sigmar, or especially if you're introducing somebody to war games in general. But you don't want them to be completely low ceiling. You definitely want a little bit of toolbox, a little bit of higher skill expression, something that once they get their feet wet into the game, they can feel their improvement and feel their skill. In general, obviously you'd want to have somebody start with whatever models they like the most, but if they're just looking for what's an easy, good army for beginners, this is the area you would like to push them toward. The Timmy Johnny side is in general where you want to go, but the Timmy Spike side is where you would push somebody that you know cares more about winning and feels discouraged if they lose the game a lot when they're starting out, things like that. So going back to just the chart, this is, again, as I said, the game state basically at the end of 2.0. And then as each of the 3.0 books come out, obviously the armies shift around slightly, their playstyle changes a little bit, they focus on different aspects of the game, and they're going to move around on this chart. So taking these one at a time, we can go through all of them very briefly as there are a lot of armies in the game, and then we'll discuss what the trend that jumped out at me as I saw this was. And again, these are based on just partially my opinion and then Vince Venturella's 2 stream discussions at the beginning of 3.0 and recently. So first we have Daughters of Cain, which just kind of added a little bit bigger numbers, which pushes it toward Timmy, and a little bit more synergy pushing it toward Johnny. It's still very much a Spike book. It just got a little bit added for the other 2 profiles here. It isn't just a pure Spike book anymore. Then we have Sylvaneth, which with the addition of Strike and Fade and a lot more teleport shenanigans, got pushed down very solidly to be a strong Johnny book. Ogre Maw Tribes with the movement and damage increases, range and damage increases, and really efficient shooting pieces like the Iron Blaster, moved from being the pure Timmy book down into the Timmy Spike area, where it is big and smashy and you have a lot of charges, but the numbers and just raw output of the units is really efficient in general as well. I know that some of them are overcosted for what they do points wise, but that doesn't really affect how they play, which is just raw number output. The Sons of Bahamut book, with getting crazy monsters actions like the suplex and the beast smashers, one giant hit that he can do instead of his normal attacks, got cemented even more as the pure Timmy book. Auric War Clans, with the addition of Cruel Boys, got a big infusion of Johnny, and the new version of Iron Jaws also leans a little bit more Spike, so it kind of moved down out of being more centrally Timmy into this hybrid area, though obviously if you're playing Bone Splitters or Iron Jaws, it's still a little bit higher toward Timmy. Fire Slayers got a little bit smashier and a little bit better buff-wise, moving just in, but still in the same general area. Stormcast lost a lot of their reliance on combos that they had when they were struggling in their 2.0 book, and got some just really reliable once per game efficient things in the Holy Orders. That is just screams Spike, honestly. Double firing long strikes and doing it in the hero phase so your opponent can't respond is a very Spike move. Maggotkin lost most of what made them Johnny-esque with the movement shenanigans, which never made sense for Nurgle anyway, and they're just a efficient wall of meat to stand on objectives. Even the random mechanic of disease points is so reliable in where you can get it and how you can ramp to the max 7 that it lands really well in the Spike area. Ideneth got a lot more Johnny-esque with the revised rituals and some extra synergies in their characters in the current book, and they aren't relying on the raw efficiency of eels anymore. OBR obviously hasn't had their 3.0 book as of filming this. It's coming out in the next week or two, but in general they've had to just shift with the meta state to rely more on efficient units than any kind of synergies or combos, just nudging them a little bit more over in Spike. Gloomspike Git's new book has a lot of synergies, a lot more than it even had before. Still has some randomness, but the randomness is toned down a little bit, especially on things like squig movement, so it's now pretty perfectly a hybrid Johnny Timmy book. Beast of Chaos new book with all of its ambush shenanigans and not as much reliance on just walls of wounds and high rend. Is this nice kind of also a Johnny Timmy book with those ambush tricks and utility units in addition to big smashy monsters and things like that. Skavens did get a new book, but it pretty much just stayed in this Johnny Timmy area with being a list builder's dream where you can customize your sub-faction effects entirely, but still having the randomness of the big red buttons on all the Skyer equipment. Soulblight Gravelord, similar to OBR, is getting a new book soon. We're not quite sure what that will look like as of filming this, but it still remains a very toolbox-heavy army, just relying a little bit more on that toolbox than it did when the book first came out. Tzeentch's new book, with the removal of the agendas and the addition of some more efficient magic casting and reliable magic casting, such as the Endless Spell at the beginning of the game, shifted along the Johnny Spike axis, going more towards Spike. Still very much an anti-Timmy book with 17 different rules for every activation and a ridiculously long hero phase, but it did get a little bit more into the efficiency side. The new Keratin Overlords book is weirdly not as efficient as it was and relies just a lot more on big numbers. Has some crazy effects that you can pull off with the frigate. This is an army I don't know very well, so its placement here could be completely wrong. It did come out after Vince's discussion that I'm kind of relying on, so if you disagree with where I placed that, let me know. Lumineth's new book, especially with its current reliance on Techless, which is the magic caster for spikes everywhere, where you don't roll, it's just on 10s, and you can turn off your opponent's magic without rolling as well, is very solidly on the spike side of this Johnny Spike spectrum. The new Slash book relies very heavily on synergies compared to its older ones, being down in this Johnny area as well. Night Haunt lost its Casino Ghosts effects with the relying on 10-inch charges, and got a little more synergy dependent or efficient depending on what subfaction you're playing. Seraphon has just been having to rely a little bit more on synergies. Still haven't gotten that new book or any real rules for it, so it just nudges over a little bit there. The new Blades of Corn book is very much still a Johnny book, but it's not quite as many hoops to jump through anymore, and you do have the ability to just splash out fighting in the hero phase and other just like big, fun, smashy effects in the new one, pushing it up more towards Timmy. This is kind of where I see the game state sitting now. So jumping back to where it was at the end of 2.0, if we take all of those movements at once, we get this, which you can notice when you see it all at once, a clear evacuation of this Timmy hybrid area, especially the Timmy Johnny side, basically exactly where we had that new player book zone. So here I've updated the cover art to the 3.0 books. You can see, again, my area of interest and the new player zone that I talked about before. Whereas before we had like 5 books solidly in this area, we really have like 3.5 here now. And the Flesh Eater Quartz book is still to come, so that might very well push it out of that zone as well. I could see that being a pretty spike-centric book. There's a noticeable crowding in my area of interest, which is one of the reasons I noticed this trend in the first place, is every new book that was coming out, I was super excited for. I started 3 new armies in the last year, and I actually had to turn around and sell one of them almost immediately because it was just too many armies all at once, and every book was more my playstyle than the last, and there's this very big focus on this Johnny Spike area at the moment. So what does that all mean? The game overall, in my opinion, is shifting more toward these Johnny synergy dependent books. There's an overwhelming choice in this Johnny Spike land. The books that are good intros for new players are fading. We're losing options that are easily recommendable, and as much as you can, lean into the rule of cool or pick your favorite models. Some players really just want to start with whatever's easiest, or they're really torn between a couple armies, and one of those armies is Lumineth, and they're really intimidated by having to cast 18 spells every magic phase, or a really techie army like Blades of Corn or OBR or anything along those lines are sometimes not the best recommendations for new players that are intimidated by the amount of rules required to play a war game. That being said, most books do have a, for lack of a better term, Timmy build. Take Oakenbrow lists and Sylvaneth. That might be enough. It might be enough for somebody to be able to just pick their favorite model line and take the smashy monster build within that army. Run 2 turtles in Ideneth, run just a bunch of bloodthirsters and Corn. That could be good enough. I'm not sure. It was always really easy to see all the recommendations for Flesh Eater Quartz or Ogres or like Iron Jaws for new players. and it seems like every new book that comes out is a little bit more complicated, a little bit more player skill dependent, and a little bit harder to understand if you're new to war games. But that is just my opinion. If you disagree with anything I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. And I definitely have other things I could go on an overly long ramble about like this. But until then, thanks for watching.